Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated by ocean life, and now I have the privilege of spending my life learning about the organisms that live in the ocean. It's easy for us as land animals to forget that most of our planet is ocean. And one of my favorite quotes is by Arthur C. Clarke when he says how strange it is to call this planet Earth when it's clearly ocean. And 80% of all habitable places on Earth is deep sea. That's not even counting the upper kilometer of ocean or upper half mile. 80% of any habitable place on Earth is deep ocean. And that's everything you can think of, from the Serengeti to the tundra, deserts, rainforests, you name it. 80% of all habitable place is deep sea. And we literally know less about that habitat than we do about other planets. We can look up at the moon, and with a telescope, you can see the surface of the moon and see craters and mountain ranges and all that. But because of the challenge of doing that through water, we've literally seen less of the seafloor. Now, what's really cool about the deep sea is that it's an environment unlike anything we've experienced. It's cold, it's perpetually dark. So once you get to about a kilometer down, there is no sunlight that reaches the depths. And this immense volume of our biosphere harbors some of the most incredible organisms that you can imagine. So many of us think about the really exotic fish that we see down there, the anglerfish, the giant jellies and the like. But what really excites me about the deep sea are the microbes that live there. When you think about an environment that's 80% of your biosphere, it's you have to realize that what happens there is going to have consequences for the rest of the world. And in fact, it's the microbes that live in the ocean that run our planet. Some people have actually called them the stewards of our planet. And it's their activity that keeps our water clean. Microbes in the ocean produce half the oxygen in our atmosphere, and they play a huge role in providing literally providing the minerals and nutrients needed for plants and animals in the shallower parts of our ocean to grow and to feed not only that ecosystem, but provide food for humankind. So these microbes are perennially fascinating because they are so different from all the other life on Earth. At the end of the day, what we do as human beings, that is, we eat organic stuff, and I don't mean organic in the grocery store sense of the word, but I mean we eat plants and we eat animals, and we harness energy from that food and from that oxygen. Now, microbes are far more exotic in how they create energy and how they work with materials, and that's why those exotic physiologies, those exotic biochemical capacities that enable them to clean the water and to produce oxygen and so on. It's also easy to forget just how many microbes there are. There are somewhere between 10 to the 26th and 10 to the 27th microbes in the ocean. That is a gigantic number. So it's a one with 26 or 27 zeros behind it. And when you think of microbes in gigantic numbers, it's easy to think, well, okay, there's a lot of them, but they're small. So, 1 million of them fit in a teaspoon of water. So just how big can 10 to the 26th be? Well, if you assume that there are 10 to the 27th microbes, and if you assume that they're a micron each in length, which is about right, and you were to put them end on end, you would end up with 10 to the 21st meters, or in other words, you're going to end up with something over 100 light years of microbes. So that means you could have microbes strung end on end from Earth out 100 light years into space, actually more than 100 light years into space. To me, that's mind-blowing when you consider that the nearest star, which we have not yet visited, is 5 light years away. And so this idea that these little tiny microbes, could stretch out past the nearest star, to me is just a reminder of how many there are, and the fact that we're clearly outnumbered. and how grateful I am for them because they keep our planet habitable. Now, if you took all those microbes and you put them on a scale and you weighed them against all of humankind, there are 100 times as many microbes by mass as there are people. So, you know, I used to think of these numbers as astronomical numbers, and now I think of them as microbial numbers when you start to realize just how immense the number and mass of microbes are on our planet. Studying life in the deep sea is about better understanding our own biosphere. When 80% of your biosphere is deep ocean, not knowing anything about it is odd to me. It's like living in a house where you never leave one room, right? And you've got a 5-bedroom home and you only live in one room. What's really cool about life in the deep sea is that it harbors ecosystems and habitats that we just don't have here on Earth. There are, in fact, hot springs on the seafloor or hydrothermal vents, and in some ways they're a lot like the hot springs on land. But because of the immense pressure of the ocean bearing down on them, they don't boil, but the temperature continues to go up. So you can have water down there that's 200 or 300 or 350 degrees centigrade in temperature. That's like your oven on self-clean mode, right? Yet living around these hydrothermal vents are really lush animal communities and microbial communities that make a living off the chemicals that come out of those vents. So the deep sea is home to two of our planet's most extreme ecosystems, and they're extreme for very different reasons. First are the hydrothermal vents, and many people have seen these. They're these really charismatic, billowing black smokers and white smokers on the seafloor, which isn't really smoke, but it's this really hot, chemically altered water that comes out of the seafloor at really high temperatures. And that's one of Earth's most extreme environments. That's in fact where you find the hottest temperatures in our biosphere. And that's in fact where you're likely going to find the most thermotolerant organisms on the planet. But animals and microbes that live there have to contend with all sorts of nasty compounds like lead and sulfur and arsenic and goodness knows what else. And so that is definitely one extreme environment. And there are likely hydrothermal vents on other moons and planets in our solar system. So understanding how these work tells us something potentially about the origins of life on Earth, as well as the possibility of other communities living on other planets far away from our own. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, another extreme environment is the deep subsurface biosphere. And when I talk about the deep subsurface biosphere, I talk about the area of the volume of sediment and rock underneath the seafloor, where they aren't faced with the most extreme temperatures, but they face a different kind of challenge. Those environments are probably some of the most energy limited environments in our biosphere. The microbes that live down there don't have access to a lot of fresh food, and they are probably living at the very edge of starvation, if you will. It doesn't mean that they're suffering or this is a tough environment for them, but it does mean that they've evolved the ability to live on very low amounts of energy, and we're just beginning to explore those habitats. So there we are in the deep sea with these two extremes, this really hot, caustic, dynamic environment where there's plenty of energy but it's rough to make a living, and this other very cool, very low energy environment where it's hard to make a living because there's just not a lot to eat. When we look at microbes living in those environments, we find that they've evolved some incredibly extraordinary abilities. One of my favorites is the ability for microbes to make electricity. Now, all life on Earth harnesses energy from the movement of electrons. And you can think of those electrons in the same way that you think of a river or a stream flowing downhill that might turn a paddle wheel at a grist mill, right? You know that the movement of that water can turn a wheel and that wheel can do work. Well, in our bodies, we eat food and it tends to have a lot of electrons, and we take those electrons and we move them through our biochemical pathways to oxygen, which really likes electrons. You can kind of think of it as an electron magnet. And it's the movement of those electrons from our food to oxygen that allows our body to regenerate our energy molecules, or ATP. It's like the energy currency. So that's what we do, right? And that's in fact what every animal on Earth does. So the way you generate energy is actually not that different than a goldfish or a newt or a giraffe or a lion, right? So at the end of the day, all animals have this, are pretty much stuck with this. We got to eat stuff and we have to use oxygen. Microbes are a totally different ball game. And there are microbes that can eat stuff, say a sugar, and take those same electrons, and instead of using oxygen as their electron magnet or their electron acceptor, they can actually use solid materials that want electrons. A good example is rust. There are microbes that literally breathe rust. So it would be like you eating a cheeseburger and touching your hand to an iron plate and using that in lieu of oxygen. So that's what microbes can do. And it helps them make a living in these extreme environments like hydrothermal vents, where these vent chimneys are in fact semi-metallic conductive structures. And microbes can grow inside, and they can be in electrical contact with oxygen that's somewhere far, far away, right? For them anyway. So it's an amazing thing that these microbes have evolved that allow them to harness energy in these really challenging environments. But what's really exciting is that for the last 15 years or so, scientists have worked hard on figuring out how can we use these electricity-producing microbes for a cleaner and more sustainable biotech. Now, some people are looking at these to produce biofuels, which is a really exciting prospect of being able to feed a microbe electricity from a solar panel and having it produce a liquid fuel. I mean, that's mind-blowing to me. And on the other end of the spectrum, what seems a little more earthy or rudimentary, but is incredibly important, is can we put these electrodes in sewage treatment plants and give them an opportunity, these electricity-producing microbes, to break down the sewage and use those electrodes to help them be more active and break down the sewage more quickly. So the idea would be that if microbes can breathe rust, as I mentioned, and use that to break down sugars, can you give these electricity-producing microbes a chance to break down sewage? And the way we would do that is we would take an electrode that we would trick the microbes into thinking was rust or something like rust. Then the microbes would grow on that electrode and they would break down the organic matter in the sewage and use that electrode to breathe. And sewage treatment is a really big deal, right? As unglamorous as it may be. And trying to get oxygen to those microbes down in the sewage sludge or other kinds of electron magnets, if you will, that's really hard. But sticking electrodes in sewage and growing those microbes and enabling them to more quickly break down the sewage, that's a really exciting thought. And so there's a lot of research going into understanding these electricity-producing microbes and this physiological process of theirs that we call extracellular electron transfer, or EET. And the opportunities really run the gamut from producing biofuels by giving them electricity from a solar panel all the way to helping us clean up our waste more efficiently. And in the meantime, harnessing a bit of electricity from that. So the beauty of basic research is that we go into the natural world, and in my case, the deep sea, and we look around and we ask questions and we develop hypotheses. And half the time we're proven wrong, and the other half the time we're studying, we see something we didn't even expect. It's a wondrous opportunity for exploration. But as we make discoveries and ask questions and kind of do the experiments that help us better understand what these organisms are doing, all sorts of applications become apparent that we may not have thought of. 20 years ago, I don't think it would have occurred to anybody to stick an electrode in sewage sludge and expect anything to happen, because microbes would grow on it and use it to breathe and break down organic matter. And here we are today trying to figure out how to make that economically viable. So that's the beauty of doing pure basic research, is we go in with our eyes open and hopefully our minds open as well, and we come out with ideas and innovations that we just frankly couldn't have predicted. So in my lab, we've played a part in this research on EET microbes, or extracellular electron transfer in microbes, and looking at the production of biofuels by feeding microbes electricity, and it's been very exciting. So one of the things that I'm interested in doing is trying to figure out how can we use these electricity producing microbes to enable us to do more research in the deep sea. There are no extension cords that we run to the seafloor. There's no gas station or solar panels, right? It's a very remote environment. And what we have been developing over the last few years are systems that we deploy in the deep ocean, on deep sea sediments, and at hydrothermal vents that literally harness the electricity from the microbes that live there. And we're using those systems to run sensors that tell us something about what the whole microbial community is doing. So it's a very cool and exciting way of using the electricity that microbes produce to facilitate our research. Now, at the same time, we're working with companies here in Massachusetts to commercialize this technology, because the cool thing about these microbial energy systems, which we call microbial fuel cells, is in the ocean, where we deploy them, they run in perpetuity. We can produce, albeit modest amounts of electricity, but we can produce it in perpetuity. They just run. And so we're working on sensor systems for oil and gas and telecommunications to help them deploy systems that don't ever run out of power. One of the issues that came out of the Deepwater Horizon accident was that there weren't enough backups. And part of that came down to the fact that they had battery backups that ran out of electricity. So even the thought of using these electricity producing microbial systems or microbial fuel cells to trickle charge batteries is really appealing, because if we can generate electricity in the deep ocean and on the seafloor and use them to monitor humankind's activities, then we really have a better chance of keeping bad things from happening. So once again, our pure research into studying what these microbes do and finding that microbes that live at hydrothermal vents produce a lot of electricity, and microbes that live in marine sediments produce a lot of electricity, has enabled us to move forward with applications that we just never could have predicted just a few years ago. In trying to understand these microbes that produce electricity, we've looked for them in a lot of different environments, and to our great surprise, these specific kinds of microbes that produce electricity are seemingly everywhere. We found them in coastal sediments. We found them in the dirt in my backyard, in forest leaf litter. I mean, just about anywhere where oxygen becomes limiting, we find these microbes there. And the reason is, it gives them an advantage in those oxygen-limiting environments. So if you don't have oxygen to breathe, but you have the capability to breathe something solid like rust or a naturally occurring mineral that can accept those electrons, that's a good deal. So it turns out that they're seemingly ubiquitous. One of the most exciting things about studying the microbes and animals that live at hydrothermal vents is getting to see the way in which microbes interact with the animals, as well as the way in which the microbes and the animals interact with the rocks. You know, we so often think of the rocks and mineral deposits and soils beneath our feet as just something we can walk on, or just as a sort of a substrate. But in fact, that's not at all the case. And microbes have a really intimate relationship with the minerals on our planet. They form many of them. They break down many others. And certainly at hydrothermal vents, the microbes play a key role in the formation of some of the mineral deposits we see there. They also play a key role in detoxifying the fluid for a lot of other animals. So these bio-geo-chemical relationships at hydrothermal vents, or the bio-geochemical relationships at hydrothermal vents, are really interesting, very complicated, but an amazing example of the way in which microbes influence the environment around them by changing the mineral composition or the fluid composition, and in turn, how the kinds of minerals and fluids that are found in an environment influence the growth of other microbes or the animals. Being a deep sea biologist means that you're half biologist and half engineer. Because of the complexity and the challenge in reproducing hydrothermal vents on a ship or on land, we develop a lot of tools to go down and study these processes in nature, or in situ as we might call it. But there are times where we really need the controlled conditions of a laboratory. And to that end, we make artificial hydrothermal vent systems. And that's something that, even being a card-carrying biologist, I've learned over the years how to build and design these apparatus. It's something I've frankly always loved doing. So I've always been a bit of a wannabe engineer. And I have an opportunity now to do that. And so we end up building systems that look a lot like what you see here. And you can see how this very large piece of equipment is quite complicated. And it takes all of this to recreate the conditions we see at vents. So for example, at a vent, it's hot, right? And it could be 200 or 300 degrees Celsius, but you need pressure to keep it from boiling. So here we have a heating jacket that fits over this. This is in fact the reactor in which we have the hydrothermal vent-like fluid and the microbes. And we can heat it, but we have to pressurize it. So we'll have big pressure pumps that we'll use to pump water in here at high pressure so it doesn't boil. Then its hydrothermal vents are turbulent, they're mixing. So we have to have a big motor up here and a motor controller that allows us to mix the fluid. Then on top of that, we have to change the chemistry. So we have these different valves here that allow us to introduce different kinds of chemicals. And we have a temperature probe to tell us what the temperature is. And then we sometimes need to make observations of the microbes while they're growing in there. So we have these specially made sapphire windows that allow us to actually shine a microscope beam, like a laser beam inside here, and to use a microscope to look at the changes in the chemicals. So it takes all of this to make a hydrothermal vent that's this big here in the laboratory. But these tools allow us to study very specific processes and relationships among microbes and the minerals that they form and they produce and the minerals that they consume. One of the things we do in my lab to help us better understand what microbes are doing in our world is build tools to make measurements that tell us something about their activity. One of the most powerful tools for making measurements are mass spectrometers. Mass spectrometers allow you to measure changes in chemical composition in a very wide range of different kinds of chemicals. And they are incredibly sensitive, and they're a very important element in an analytical laboratory. Well, about 10 years ago, I decided that one of the things that we really need to do is build a mass spectrometer that we could take into the deep sea and make these chemical measurements. And the idea is that if we go down into the deep ocean and we collect samples of microbes, we can see who's there and maybe even what genes are being turned on and proteins are being made, but we can't actually tell you what they're doing. We can't measure a rate of methane production or a rate of oxygen utilization. Now, if we go down and we collect a sample and we try to preserve it for those chemical measurements, that's great, and it works, but it's often really hard and very expensive. We can spend $15,000 to $20,000 to $25,000 to make a single sampling vessel for one measurement. So if I want to go down and make 5 measurements on a cruise, I need 5 vessels that are $20,000 each or $100,000. And so then it occurred to me that maybe what we need to do is bring the laboratory into the deep sea. And to that end, I started building and designing this tool you see back here, our underwater mass spectrometer. And this allows us to go down and using a submarine like the Alvin or an ROV, both of which we use in my laboratory to do our research. It allows us to take this down and put it on the vehicle and use the manipulator arm to make precise chemical measurements on the seafloor. Now, it can measure the concentration of dissolved gases. That's what this mass spec is designed to do. So we can measure oxygen or nitrogen, carbon dioxide, For microbes, gases like hydrogen sulfide and methane and hydrogen are really important. And we can measure all of those. And we can get the data back in real time while we're sitting on the ship with the robot sub, or while we're in the submarine like Alvin. And we can look at those data and make informed decisions about where we want to take our samples. So it's a really amazing tool that allows us to make these measurements in real time. Now, there are two other things I'd like to share, and that is, I mentioned those sampling bottles costing between $15,000 and $20,000. Well, this entire instrument costs between $15,000 and $20,000 for the instrument you see in front of you. And the housing has different costs depending on where you want to go. But with this one instrument, we can make hundreds, if not thousands, of measurements on a single dive. And we often come back from an expedition with 500,000 geochemical measurements made, and that allows us to better understand the activity of the microbes that we've sampled on the seafloor. Having this instrument allows us to make those measurements in real time and to do our sampling more intelligently. And it's important to remember that not all vents and not all seeps and not all marine sediment is the same. There's a lot of variation just within a few centimeters of one another. And so we've historically been hindered by our inability to look at that finer scale variation. It's important to remember that microbes, again, are about a micron in length. And so if I take a sample from one point and I move a meter away, that is an absurd distance for a microbe, right? That is a completely different universe. It's as, imagine a race of giant aliens coming to Earth, and they grabbed a sample of Boston, right, with their hands and just ground us all up and said, this is what humans look like. It's unlikely that that would be fully representative of the diversity of all humans. Certainly not the diversity of our environment, right? So in the same way, when we study microbes, we really have to get to the point where we're studying them at the appropriate scale, both spatially and in time. And using tools like this and developing tools like this allows us to go down there and make more precise measurements that are more ecologically relevant.